Hello, and welcome to a bonus episode in our pilot series called STEM Squared, an educational cosmos that combines science, technology, engineering, and math with teaching and learning. My name is Dr. Michael Hammond Todd, and I am your host for this podcast. And as a quick update, we are publishing this podcast in October of 2022. We have been following the Artemis 1 mission, and the mission launch date hasn't happened yet. It's been pushed back to November, and so we decided to create a bonus episode that looks at the moon. And so we are going to STEM square the moon in this episode and look at the moon as an educational object of fascination for societies as long as humanity can view that lovely night sky. And we're also going to be touching in on the Canadian Space Agency and educational resources associated with Canadian STEM education as it relates to the Artemis 1 program and the moon. But before we do that, let's get into the news. I have 3 items for the news to share with you in this podcast. Now, the first concerns NASA's update on the Artemis 1 launch. As you know, the new date is November 14th, which I will link in this podcast description. That gives NASA time to fix and adjust some of the components on the vehicle and to make sure that the launch site is safe and secure, having recently experienced Hurricane Ian. And so hopefully everything will be on target for a November 14th launch. And that leads us into the second bit of news, which actually comes from Canada, the Canadian Space Agency. Canada has announced that they have 4 astronauts as possible candidates for the Artemis 2 mission in 2024. Astronaut Jeremy Hansen, Joshua Kutrick, David St. Jacques, and Jenny Sidney Gibbons. Now, one of these astronauts will likely have the opportunity to occupy the 4th seat on the Artemis 2 launch in 2024. And I have linked an article for if you're interested in more information about these 4 astronauts. Now, the final bit of news is in the series I've been talking a lot about NASA's educational programs, but it's important to realize that many of the participating countries in the Artemis Accords have their own space agencies and educational lessons and activities. And so I would encourage the listeners, particularly my friends and colleagues here in Canada, to look at the lessons and activities for Canadian students or any student interested in learning more about the Canadian Space Agency. Now, that link is in the description for this podcast. Let's return to the show. Welcome back to STEM Squared. And if you haven't heard the pilot episodes, I'd encourage you to go back because we introduced the idea of the STEM Squared learning matrix, which combines the field of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, with society, transformative education, exceptional and multicultural inclusion. And so if you want to familiarize with yourselves with those connections, I encourage you to listen to the first series in this podcast. So here, what we're going to do is we are going to STEM square the moon. And we're going to do it in just one bonus episode. And so let's look at the connection between the moon and society. The moon, in history, was likely humanity's first nightlight. It allowed us to explore and better understand the environments that we traveled across as early humanity. The moon has many different names: La Luna and Humado Skew, or, of course, the moon itself. And it provides an endless source of fascination for artists, photographers, and astronomers. Many people write stories and poetry dedicated to the moon, but the moon also exerts a significant influence upon the Earth, and perhaps its most significant physical influence on the Earth relates to its influence on the world's oceans, the high and low tides, which can form a major source of uh, tidal energy in the world. And in fact, Canada is the world's fourth largest producer of tidal energy. South Korea, our friends in South Korea, are the number one producers of tidal energy. And it is interesting to think of the energy provided by both the sun and the moon as they act upon our beautiful planet. In addition to its aesthetic elements, there are a lot of interesting resources on the moon for our astronauts as they make their way to it in 2024. There are recent discoveries of large-scale deposits of water and oxygen. In fact, enough oxygen to support a population of 8 billion people for approximately 100,000 years. And so it looks like the moon is an increasingly interesting place for humanity to go to and explore, and in itself may serve as an important launching area and hub for further space exploration. It's possible, too, that as the field of asteroid mining emerges in the latter half of this century, that the moon may serve as an important reception area for some of the precious minerals and other items manufactured outside our atmosphere. And so there are some fascinating connections between society and the moon. What transformative STEM elements exist? The T in STEM squared. And so when we think about the moon and 5, 10, and 15-year-olds, let's take a 5 by 5 by 5 moment here. Many children have the misconception that the moon and the sun oftentimes are moving when in reality the rotation of the Earth is probably more of a factor. However, the moon itself does have movements that can be challenging for young children to understand. And it's interesting to point out that you can see the moon during the day. Many children also have the misconception that the moon itself produces some kind of light, when in fact that is the reflection of the sun, which again illuminates the solar potential of our first star, which we'll be exploring in future episodes. For 10 and 15-year-olds, it might be interesting to explore the conceptions and misconceptions related to distance and the engineering of habitats upon the moon. There are a lot of misconceptions about the moon as um, as completely inhospitable to life, yet there appears to be discoveries of water and oxygen which allow for creative engineering of human habitats on the lunar surface. Many 10 and 15-year-olds may be interested in understanding gravity as it relates to its differences on the different size of the moon and other planets in our solar system. And it's also interesting to think about gravity and its effects on asteroids as that sector emerges later on this century. Other misconceptions that 15-year-olds may have relate to how vehicles travel in space and the nonlinear nature of space travel. And so, lessons on how the Artemis 1 vehicle launches, reaches, orbits, and returns to Earth can be quite insightful from a mathematical perspective for our secondary students. Educators interested in exploring gravity and travel to the moon may be interested in accessing NASA's description of the lunar lander, which includes a simulator, and there will be a link to that in the podcast. Now, that is it for the first part of STEM squaring the moon. And so we talked about the connections between society and transformative education as it relates to your moon and lunar landing lessons. In the second bonus episode, we'll take a look at exceptional and multicultural inclusion as it relates to the moon and teaching about the Artemis 1 program. If you have any questions about this episode, this bonus episode, please feel free to contact us at stemsquared@gmail.com. And always remember to keep looking up in that educational cosmos. And we will see you in the second bonus episode as we get closer to the Artemis 2 launch on November 14th.